Kia ora. It's my privilege to introduce to you the painter and sculptor John Bevan Ford and his artistic series Te Hono, or The Connections. Like many people living in this country, John is the descendant of both waves of migrants who have come to Aotearoa, the first from Hawaii around 1,000 years ago, and the second from Great Britain in the 19th century. On his Pākehā side, John is a descendant of Thomas Bevan, who came out in the 1840s and who settled at a small place called Waikawa, a little beach looking out towards Kapiti Island from near the mouth of the Otaki River. Here he traded in flax, ran a ferry across the river, and established close links with the tangata whenua, the Ngāti Raukawa. These links were cemented when his son married a woman of the Ngāti Raukawa, and John is a fourth-generation descendant of that marriage. The Ngāti Raukawa themselves were comparative newcomers to that part of the coast. Their ancestral canoe, the Tainui, had landed much further north, and the tribes descended from it had settled in the Waikato area. But in the 1820s, partly as a result of warfare in the north, and partly because of the potential for lucrative flax trade with British whalers in the Cook Strait area, the chief Te Raupraha led parts of the Ngāti Toa and the related Ngāti Raukawa people down south to settle on Kapiti and the coast opposite. John was actually brought up in the South Island, away from his Turanga Waiwai, and it was really only as an adult that he began to explore the personal and the social implications of his Maori identity. These explanations were in part carried out through the series that we will be looking at, the Te Hono or Connections series. The connections John was making were at one level personal ones, a rediscovery of his own Maori identity. But more importantly, they were part of a wider collective reassertion of the centrality of Maori culture in our national life. John belongs to the pioneer generation of what is now widely called the Maori Renaissance. These were artists who combined their skills in European artistic techniques with the rediscovery and a new understanding of Maori crafts and Maori values. They wove these together to create a new art which was unique to Aotearoa, blending together the traditional and the modern, the Maori and the Pākehā. It is an art which in large measure will help restore this country to its tangata whenua, to the Maori people. But it is also an art which speaks to Pākehā, giving us a deeper insight into the land that we share.
Waikawa here is the source, and it wasn't until I eventually arrived back at the source that I really had the strength and the freedom to go wider than that. And later on in the drawings, the works, we will see how the horizons widen and widen. Kapiti, Waikawa, Taranaki, Waiponamu, and so on. So there it is. Why are we here? Because this is where it all starts from. Te Hono, The Connections, grew from a series of works called Kapiti. Kapiti Island as itself, Kapiti as a symbol for Waikawa, Kapiti for the whole of the Kapiti coast and for all its people, especially for my own Ngāti Raukawa ki Kapiti. We have fought, loved, lived, died and danced here for the past 160 years. The early drawings of Kapiti are engraved with carving patterns, long curving high lines containing Pāketi notches in the style of our former homeland, Waikato. Over several years I had developed a habit of using traditional patterns to symbolize the people who made them, so it was natural for me to draw Kapiti in this way. In these drawings you will occasionally find tukutuku wall panel patterns which are used by me, as were the carving patterns, to symbolise the people of the area. Also images of carved faces. They are derived from the face of the figure on a canoe prow and are intended to symbolise our tribal journeys in respect of Kapiti. From Waikato and Taranaki to Kapiti, from Kapiti to the lands about and beyond. These journeys also resonate with the earlier ancestral journeys from Hawaii to New Zealand. In some cases, the faces hang in the sky and therefore connect us with concepts of wairua, reflecting our freely wandering, restless spirits. Within this Kapiti series, there are also a variety of drawings with panel-like spaces containing their own mini-structures and moods. Within these mini-structures, we may sometimes see the connection with harakeke, flax as it grows and flax as it's plaited. Flax was the material for clothes, for kete, for mats, and in particular during the 1830s and 1840s was the basis of our trade with the Europeans. Now for a while the harakeke in its various forms of plaiting and weaving dominates the work, while Kapiti stands quietly by. From the notion of muka, the flax fibre, as sustenance to our physical being, it began to emerge as the basic material from which, in actual life, we structure one of the great symbols of mana made for our chiefly leaders and elders, the multi-pattern kahu or cloak. The muka is not only the material for the body of the cloak, but also the material for the taniko patterns that so ornately proclaim our reverence and awe for those human symbols of our tribal identity, our ariki. The concept of the cloak soon firmed up in the drawings, sometimes like a mist enveloping the island, and eventually as if the cloak of some invisible elder were drifting above the land and sea, a symbol of mana lifted up as it were, making room for us all, a cloak to warm us, to bind us, to spiritually enfold us. From time to time, I've also been asked to create large public symbols of identity. Much of that is in Taranaki, but gradually also a little here in the Manawatu. In these works, there have been many helpers, like Manu and Warren, working on these rangitane works to be gifted to the university. Further experience that had an impact back there on the Kapiti series was this. About 3 years ago, I was invited along with 9 other Māori artists to spend 8 days carving stone at the Dowse Art Museum. The Dowse project was designed to explore once more the ancient art of large stone carving. We worked with steatite brought from the South Island, the Waipuna. During the project, the South Island elder and rangatira, Ricky Ellison, died, so the subsequent exhibition the Dowse Gallery mounted of these works was dedicated to Ricky. I have inherited from my mother a snapshot of herself with Ricky and Morris Pohio representing things Māori at some celebrations, at least in Ellesmere in the South Island during the 1930s. Working with stone brought me face to face with Papatuanuku, the earth ancestress, and so to Hine Ahuone in the remote beginnings of our existence. Suddenly, as I returned to the drawings, Kapiti became personified, a being with its own mana, no longer just a place covered with people. In expressing this concept, it is the traditional manaya or side face carving motive that is used. It's a symbol to emphasize the deep and universal life forces that move independently of living man and woman. Richard Castles, at that time assistant director at the Manawatu Museum, showed me a work that he had uncovered near Patea. It was one of the most ancient pieces of wood carving so far discovered in New Zealand. As a lecturer of Māori art, I could not avoid having to carefully examine this ancient canoe prow cover with its punch-marked spirals and straight-line patterns organised across a central running notched rib. Eventually, by using these patterns in the drawings, I make connections with much earlier journeys along the west coast, much earlier than those to and from Kapiti in the 1820s. While visiting European art galleries, the gold leaf painting of the 14th century painters of my Pākehā side made an immediate impression, as these contemporary drawings indicate. Now, 7 years later, a small gold ink eye still winks out from the Pakake and Manaya images of Kapiti. I should explain that the Pakake Manaya form stands for the whale, which, in this context, represents both the Maori and European whaling that went on at Kapiti. Through the Pakake, I can explore my own Maori and Pākehā ancestry, as well as the many other matters already mentioned. The kahu once served to warm our body and spirit. As a symbol, it may now help protect us from the truths that are too sharp to bear directly. And through its abstract tarnical patterns, we're reminded that the real world is an ambivalent mixture of changing hues.
Well, was it really through your art itself that you began to penetrate your Maori background, rediscover it and express it?
Certainly to express it, and that came about through being involved in education and being involved in art education. Supervisor of Arts and Crafts in New Zealand at that time was a gentleman called Gordon Tovey, who's now passed away. And he was a great innovator, and very early in the piece, he decided that the monocultural aspect of New Zealand education needed to be broached. And he started off by making sure that amongst his art advisors, he got a very fair proportion of Maori people. We worked with Pine Taiapa, who was a grand old man of carving in New Zealand at that time, and other people at Ruatoria, to come face to face with our Maori inheritance in the arts. Now, one of the things that old Pine said to us is that, all right, I've done a lot of carving, and I can show you how to hold this chisel and that chisel and make this cut and that cut. But if you are going to do anything really meaningful with your art, you have to go back to your old people, your own people, to find out where you stand and what is the essence of what you have to do.
Does this mean that working as a Maori artist, your work has to be traditional?
No, it didn't mean that, because if you take the concept of traditional as meaning just repeating the things of the past, that is not what Pene meant. He meant to do things that were traditional in that they brought into the immediate present all of your Maori thought. And that meant that if it was going to have that sort of identity, it had to be creative. It had to look at the people not only where they came from, but where they stood today in relation to where they came from. So that meant that if we were to be creative, then we did have to find out who we were.
And that brings us back in a way to Waikawa, doesn't it?
That's it. So I had to come back here to my old people and really figure it out.